So welcome everybody. My name is Jessie Slafter. I'm going to be your trainer today on boundaries. And I hope you guys are having a good NAMI conference so far. Since this training, ideally, I know the Zoom format makes it a little more challenging to be interactive, but I always love your questions because, as we often hear, if you have a question, it probably means somebody else has the same question. So I would love if you're able to put any questions or anything you have throughout the training in the chat. Looks like Erica not able to hear anything. Is everybody else able to hear? You can give me a thumbs up or on your chat. Okay, great. Okay, and the chat says so Erica, sorry, sounds like it might be a tech challenge on your end. Oh, you can't hear me say that anyway. Oh, that's a rough situation.
I'll reach out to her.
Okay, great. So feel free to put questions, comments in the chat and I'll read them. We are going to get started. So my name is Jessie Slafter, as I said at the beginning, and at the end, the last slide, you'll have my contact information. I always love hearing from anybody after the training, hearing what people thought, how it's going. If you have any other questions or follow-up. Some other common questions is I believe you will get a copy of this PowerPoint at the end. And I can tell you the PowerPoint is, it's really the content is the verbal part of what I'm sharing. And then there's also a couple of handouts we're going to go over the end, which I think are super useful for talking about our own boundaries and for creating a path for how we change our kind of move forward in our boundaries. Yes, so let us get started. So this training came together. I'm a part of Parents and Caregivers for Wellness as well. And Parents and Caregivers for Wellness is a statewide collaborative of organizations that serve parents and caregivers and families of children that have mental health needs. And we, in some of the trainings that we put together and travel around the state to provide, was talking about compassion fatigue. And if you're in this training, you probably have heard that expression. Maybe you're an expert on understanding compassion fatigue, but that compassion fatigue, burnout, and vicarious trauma are all very common. And in fact, I'd say 100% of us have experienced that if we have worked with or supported or loved or experienced ourselves mental illness, or if we're working in the field as mental health providers. And the symptoms of burnout are that, I start to get sort of fed up with the job that I'm doing, and things that would excite me about the job are not quite as exciting anymore. But compassion fatigue, in contrast, is something where even when I go home from work or when I quit my job, that I start to get challenged in my identity, right? Like, the struggles that I'm having in my job aren't just things that I'm feeling while I'm at my work. It's stuff that follows me home, where I'm like laying up in bed at night thinking about whether I'm even cut out for this job, whether I'm even, maybe this is an indicator of something else going on with me and my family, where we start to doubt ourselves. Maybe we start to have challenges sleeping. We start to maybe have some obsessive thoughts, and that really the compassion fatigue is like a vine that kind of grows all the way down within us and takes a lot more than just a simple trim to be able to cut off that level of being drained. And the reason that I train on this is that I'm a lawyer and I'm a social worker. And I represent children in foster care, in addition to working with Parents and Caregivers for Wellness. I work with the organization East Bay Children's Law Offices in Alameda County. And I have worked with children in the probation system, children in foster care for, 10 plus years. And so I have experienced a lot of burnout, a lot of compassion fatigue, and I've also really struggled with boundaries, and have now come to a place where I'm feeling much stronger in my boundaries. And so I'm giving this training about it. So we'll do a little roadmap for today. So this is like, we're following this road here. And I told you about Parents and Caregivers for Wellness, which is the organization where we serve parents and caregivers across the state. We talked for a second there about burnout and compassion fatigue. We are next going to define boundaries, and we're going to be sort of brief on the definition of boundaries. And we're going to give some sort of funny examples of different types of boundaries that we may see in our workplaces or in other environments that we're in, of whether you're really rigid with your boundaries or really open. And then we'll talk a little bit about the purpose, the characteristic and types of boundaries, and then finally end with the wisdom of boundaries. And again, you're going to get a couple of handouts at the end of the training that are incredibly useful if you're in a role where you're supervising or you're able to facilitate conversations about boundaries. You'll get some good tools walking away from here. But really, I think the important aspect is just thinking about it, thinking about my own boundaries. So this training is to help you think about what kind of boundaries do I have and why do I have those, and do those affect how I'm working? Because I think we have to interrogate our own boundaries in order to know which direction we want to move, whether we want to be more open, more closed. So first, what are your boundaries? And this is based off of a worksheet that I'll be talking about of understanding, rigid versus moderate versus porous boundaries. The worksheet that I have describes the middle range as healthy, but I think healthy is a value judgment, and all of us have formed our boundaries based on what was normal for our upbringing. And so it's not so much as healthy or unhealthy, but kind of more open, more rigid or closed, and then more moderate in the middle. And that again is based on whatever our upbringing is and what we're used to. Somebody said it sounds intermittently garbled, and that's probably just the way I talk. So I'm sorry, I'll try not to mumble, try to be clear. So with rigid boundaries are, think of this as, do I identify with any of this? You may avoid personal relationships if you have rigid boundaries. You may be unlikely to ask for help. So any of you unlikely to ask for help, struggling to ask for help, may have few close personal relationships, be very protective of personal information, so very private. You may seem detached, even with romantic partners, and may keep others at a distance to avoid the possibility of rejection. So the analogy that I want to help, or the metaphor I want to have in your minds for this conversation about the types of boundaries, is thinking of a castle. And if you have very rigid boundaries, that means your castle probably has very high walls, very few entrances, maybe a moat, maybe you have a wall outside of the moat, you have a drawbridge, and you keep that thing shut down, it's locked up. And that, rigid boundaries is that I'm scared, maybe I've been hurt before, maybe I was raised that way, where we're not necessarily, we are not necessarily feeling safe for some reason, or maybe culturally we have a practice that is, we're not trusting other people unless they prove it to us. So our drawbridge is up, our moat is wide, and we have sort of rigid boundaries. On the other side, with porous boundaries, this is maybe that your castle is just a little cottage and you keep your door open all the time and you don't have that moat or that wall, or your drawbridge is always down. For porous boundaries, you may overshare personal information. Tell you, that's me, oversharing personal information. Somebody could pay me a compliment about my outfit, and I'm going to tell you where I bought it all and how much it cost and the story of the time I went to the store and who was with me, and I was in a fight with somebody when I went there. And by the end of that compliment you gave me, you're regretting it because you know absolutely everything about my life. And so also porous boundaries, you may have difficulty saying no to others. And this, having done this training a dozen or so times, saying no is one of the things that I hear over and over again from attendees of the training, of like, saying no is really hard. How do I practice saying no? So if needing to practice saying no is something that you struggle with, we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but that also can be an indication of a porous boundary. Over-involved with others' problems. So if I don't have a clear property line, I don't have a castle, I don't have a moat, I don't have a drawbridge, then your problems are my problems. I don't even know where you end and where I begin, because we're all kind of meshed together. We may be dependent on the opinions of others, because again, there's an enmeshment. It's like, whatever you think, well, maybe that is true about me. I don't really know what's true about me, or what's your opinion. We also, because of that, may be accepting of abuse or disrespect. And we may fear rejection if we don't comply with others. And so, again, not having clear boundaries means that what's yours and what's mine is blurry to me. And so I take on both the good and the bad. So then somewhere in the middle, we're splitting the difference between this rigid and this porous boundary, which means maybe you're in a castle, but you've got a lot of entrances. You open the drawbridge down at certain times. You have a protocol for how you know when somebody is trustworthy that you let in. You value your own opinions and you don't compromise that for others. You share information in an appropriate way. You know your personal wants and needs, and you communicate them. And you also accept no from other people. So if you have better boundaries yourself, then you're more likely to appreciate, respect, and spot the boundaries of other people. So then looking at this right side here of the screen of these different categories, some of these should be pretty straightforward, so I won't spend a ton of time on them, of thinking about your physical boundaries, intellectual, physical boundaries and sexual boundaries. I think the ones that are interesting are thinking about my intellectual, emotional, spiritual boundary. Is basically, you are violating these boundaries if you are telling me how to feel, if you're telling me how to think, or if you're telling me what to believe in. So if you have a friend or a loved one or a family member who's frequently saying like, no, I can't believe you think that way, especially as we're going into a political climate, that if we're trying to get into somebody else's heads or their emotions to correct what we think is a wrong way of thinking or feeling or believing, we are violating that boundary, which is like, I'm allowed to think and feel and believe in what I believe in. And physical and sexual, you can not touching me or advancing or hugging or my things if I've set a boundary. And then the ones that were illuminating to me as I first put this presentation together are time boundaries. I don't know how many of you have ever thought of, I have a time boundary, and that if I am really loose or porous on my time boundaries, then I'm probably running late to everything. I'm probably, the moment that I'm, walking the dog and I'm getting into a conversation with a neighbor, and all of a sudden 20 minutes have gone by and I'm late for everything else that day. And that's partly because I struggle saying, oh, I've got to go, like, good to see you. But that holding time boundaries and work or with family or with loved ones can be a place that we struggle too. And then material and financial is like, I have the right to make decisions about my money and my things. And that also means that, like, it's okay for me to say I'm not comfortable with lending something or spending something or investing in something, because I've set that boundary. So if you have any questions about those, I think hopefully this should feel sort of familiar and pretty basic. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but if you do have any questions, you can feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll get to it as we're going through these slides. And now this is a fun description of different types of boundaries. And so listen up. I'm going to describe these different types of these different characters we have here. And this will help us, I think, who do we identify with as I'm describing these different personalities. So the first is hyper rigid Heather. So hyper rigid Heather, she only does what is needed and what her job description details. She doesn't communicate with a lot of warmth. Families may feel like she cares when she's working with them, but they'll have trouble, or feel like she doesn't care, but they'll have trouble explaining why. And she may be heard saying, well, that's our protocol. So hyperrigid Heather, and this, when I do this for a little longer training, and if you have thoughts about this, I'd love for you to put it in the chat. What underneath is hyperrigid Heather feeling? Like, why is her guard so up? And then how do we help hyperrigid Heather? So if we have a friend or a colleague or a loved one who's hyperrigid Heather, what can we do to help hyperrigid Heather feel more open and warm with the family she's working with? So feel free to put that in the chat. I'm going to ask these questions as we go. Not seeing anything on the chat, just so we can keep moving. What I have here is that Heather fears she would break if she were to open her heart to the family she's working with. And, one of the ways that we can connect with Heather is to talk about the way that her cases make her feel, or the family she's working with make her feel, so that she can get used to the practice of realizing that having emotion about something doesn't mean we're going to break. So maybe someone who's incredibly rigid, hyper-rigid Heather, has an experience in the past where loving so hard or caring too much about work or a family or someone who's struggling means that I'm going to fall apart if I were to let my heart open. And so what we do is we kind of dose that person on, like, you can let your heart open a little bit, and I promise, like, you're not going to break. And we practice that a little bit if this is someone that we care about or work with. We've got been doing this so long, Bernard. So been doing this so long, Bernard is someone who knows the work well, but may not feel the difference between traumatic and routine events in their cases. So they may make jokes about their client's circumstances, may overshare information about them, may seem to have inconsistent emotional reactions to the facts that they're talking about, like smiling about something terrible or seeming neutral about something that's really good news. And been doing this so long, Bernard may be overheard saying, we'll see, about anything that you can tell them. So this, I base this off of a colleague that I work with who, I'll say, oh my gosh, little Timmy just graduated high school. And he's like, we'll see, great for Timmy, kind of not that excited. And I could call and say, little Timmy just got arrested. And it's sort of like, we'll see, that sort of things kind of all blend together because we've been doing this so long and we're kind of numb to it. So again, pose those two questions for you to think about. What is been doing this so long, Bernard, feeling underneath that leads to this manifestation of these boundaries? And how do we help Bernard to feel more connected to the families? And again, feel free to put responses to this in the chat. I'm going to keep moving through. So Bernard is sort of comfortable, right? Bernard, in order to work a really long time, decades in a field where we're constantly working with high ups and high downs, sometimes it feels like if we just were to follow the up and to follow the down, it would be too exhausting. So we start to get a nice even hum where we're not really going up or down. But what means we also miss out on sort of following what's happening on the up and down. And I think, for my example, and again, these are not textbook, these are just my thoughts on it, that we help Bernard by talking about examples of Bernard feeling cynical. And thank you guys for your comments. So Bernard is a comment here that Bernard is feeling tired and burnt out. Maybe remind him of his motivation. Great point. And then cynical and thinking his work doesn't matter. Thank you. I think, and feels stuck in his comfort zone. He's seen and heard it all before. Nothing is surprising. Value his long experience and illuminate the feeling in the moment of someone else. And great suggestion. So reminding him of why he started this job. So the other one, the one that I have is similar to what you guys are talking about, of talking about examples where Bernard had an impact. So for any of us that are working with people where it just feels like, oh my gosh, I don't have an impact, I feel kind of helpless, and as Tori's saying, protective of emotions, that we want to give an example of, like, your relationship does matter, like how you show up for this family or this person does matter, and here's how I know that it matters. Now, over-involved Eileen. So over-involved Eileen, this is a one that, again, doing this training, people tend to really resonate with over-involved Eileen, because if you've worked in this field or you have a lot of friends or loved ones that have mental illness, the boundaries start to get pretty blurred. So over-involved Eileen knows all of her clients' details and is available any time of day or night. She feels her client's pain and she shares hers back to them. She takes it personally when they struggle. She may use her own money or her vehicle to help her families, even if it's against the rules. And she may be overheard saying, "I'm exhausted." So take a second, put it in the chat. Why is Eileen doing this? So what is it about Eileen's boundaries that is making her get so over-involved? Why is she doing this? And then how do we help Eileen? So great comment here. She's addicted to feeling helpful or useful. And that is definitely that feeling helpful or useful, if that's incredibly important to me, that I'm going to look for opportunities to feel helpful or useful. And I'm going to think first about how it makes me feel and not think as much about whether it's in my job or whether the family actually needs this help, because I'm thinking about myself. Eileen has no boundaries and is perhaps codependent. So codependent being that I'm, relying on somebody else, depending on me. And it's, dangerous and draining. And Eileen is a people pleaser. The boundaries are porous. So you guys are great getting this terminology. So Eileen is, if you think of, she's a little cottage and is combining with everybody else. Her problems, it doesn't know where she begins and where they ends. Great comment here that it gives a feeling of control. So that's also something else that can be challenging for us to see sometimes, is that I do all the things I do to help others because I want to be able to control what's happening. So I want my hand in all of the pots. And again, the key thing is that that's about me, and that it's not necessarily sustainable. I'm probably going to burn out. It takes the focuses off her issues. Great point. So I might really dive into my work if it helps me to not think about what's going on in my own home. Fear, obligation, guilt, sees the big picture of extensive needs, but forgets she has a team to meet all the needs. Then also start to shift a little bit to how do we help Eileen? And so how do we help Eileen to shift out of that pattern of, codependency or control? So put some of your guys' comments are so great. You're clearly on point with this, or maybe you're identifying with Eileen, but would love to hear your comments on how do we help her. So some of the things that I have written down are that having good rules and protocols. So if you are in a space or in a managerial role, or you're in charge of Eileen, that having rules sometimes can help. For example, to say, it gives Eileen a fallback where she can say, I would love to pick you up and drive you, 8 hours to Los Angeles, but I can't because my job wouldn't let me. And that sometimes maybe Eileen herself would have done that, but she gets to fall back on the rules and protocols. We have some suggestions here. Remind her that she's only responsible for herself, definitely. Define the boundaries for her and remind her that they keep both and her clients safe. So that's a great point. We want to talk about the underlying purpose of boundaries, which is what we're doing today. That, that boundaries are not just like an annoying thing that gets in the way of our work. Boundaries are something actually that provides safety for us and safety for our clients. And question is, how can she put those boundaries back in place? And that is a great question, because I have definitely had the experience, and I'm guessing some of you have too, where we are a certain way with our clients, and then we realize, oh, this isn't sustainable for me, or actually this is kind of seems harmful for my client. And then we have to have this shift where I go from maybe driving my client every day and calling them all the time and spending my own money, and I have to have this shift to where I'm not doing that. And I've definitely, gone through that in my own work where I was similar to over-involved Eileen. And I think we have to be brave enough to have a conversation so that we're not just switching without, we're not just switching up the way that we're behaving without having any recognition of it. And then we, as somebody was saying in the chat, I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it. Ali Mink was saying in the chat about keeping safety, is that you can have sort of a conversation about why boundaries are so important. And, and also making it reestablishing what my role is. A helpful tool for all of you that really helps me and that I've shared with a lot of others is that sometimes it helps me to think of myself like a robot that is programmed to do certain tasks. Like I'm programmed to, be available during certain times, to like show up and do certain tasks. And, and that includes like as a family member or whatever, like I'm programmed to have X amount of compassion and to show up in this way. And that anytime somebody is calling upon me to do something that I'm not programmed to do, it's not about blame or shame or about anger. I don't have to set a boundary with, I'm mad, you pushed me so far, like I'm setting a boundary, but that it's a sort of simple, like I'm not programmed to do that. And obviously maybe not using the programmed language, but I don't have to think of it as someone's tearing me down and I have to set this boundary, this flaming wall between me and this other person. But I can think of it as something that's like not within my programming, it's not within my task, and it's not personal. So then agree, other comments here, agree that she needs to be reminded about self-care. Ask herself and her client to brainstorm the way that the needs can be met and ask the client to be involved in solution. Great comment. And, so thinking about, that like boundaries themselves are something that are a constantly growing and changing process. And so we do want it to be something that we're, sort of communicating with love and doing as part of our self-care. And so it sounds like some of you are not crazy about the robot analogy, losing our humanity. That's totally fine. If that's, these are all things that are sort of, if it fits, let it sit. If it doesn't apply, let it fly. Any tool that you like here today, feel free to take. But if there's anything that I say that doesn't really land with you or doesn't feel right, totally fine to let it go. I'm certainly not, not here to supplant any of your own wisdom about boundaries. Okay, so let's move on to Where'd You Go, Walter? Where'd You Go, Walter does his job, but is otherwise out of here. So don't expect to see Walter at any gatherings or anything for socializing. And Walter may be heard saying, wait, what happened? And so Walter is that person that that like barely kind of shows up for the bare minimum and then is gone. And so underneath, Walter is barely keeping it together and needs to get straight home or to the office to survive. And similar with Walter to Bernard, where we can provide Walter with examples of effectiveness to allow Walter to sort of recover along with the rest of us and not feel like he has to bounce. Though, of course, sometimes we do need that space away. And we have a question here about how can a family member do this? And for that commenter, if you can clarify on the what is the this there. So if we're talking about the robot example, which I know some of you are not a fan of, I think the family example for me is sometimes if anything comes up for me and my family, my initial instinct is that my job is to give 100% of myself to sort of just dissolve and, kind of become whatever it is that my family needs. And something that I found really helpful for me with my family is I ask myself first, like between me and Jessie, what does it mean to me to be a good daughter? Because to me, it doesn't mean to be a good daughter or to be a good sister or to be a good mother. It doesn't mean that I completely dissolve myself and become everything for my mom or for my sister or for my child. That's not what being a good daughter means. We'll use the example of daughter. And so being a good daughter might mean something for me, like I'm showing up when my mom reaches out If she is in a crisis, I show up in this way. You know, and so for me, I'm thinking to myself, like, what does it mean to be a good daughter? And of course, it doesn't have to be so rigid that I don't do anything outside of that, or that it has to be this definition. But I think when we're talking about relating to a family member, we want to first define for ourselves, like, what feels comfortable for me. And that's sort of the robot programming or whatever, if that is a helpful way for you to think of it. And then we want to practice doing the things that are important to me. So sticking within my values, the way that is important to me to show up as a daughter or a mother, as a sister, and as opposed to reacting only to what others need from me and then trying to readjust later, which, again, knowing that it's much easier said than done. But as a little tip, that if you're feeling like I am just, again, like I have the image of sort of dissolving and becoming what everybody else wants me to be, that I can pause whenever I have a chance to and define for myself, what are the key components of this relationship to me, and how do I show up for those? And then how do I draw a boundary in the spaces where, no, it doesn't mean that I'm available 24/7. It means that I'm available, you know, this amount of time or whatever feels right for you. And so Allie made a comment about getting back to Walter, that maybe this is the only tool Walter has learned for his self-care. He compartmentalizes. Totally. And sometimes too, as with any of these, I don't mean to put value judgments on Heather or Bernard or Eileen or Walter, but more that all of us are going to express our boundaries in different ways. And here are some kind of fun examples. And in the case where we are wanting this person to reconnect and re-engage, that we want to have some tools to be able to talk about that if we need to, or if we are Walter, that we might want to, you know, encourage ourselves a little bit to think about the ways that our absence affects people also. Okay, so moving on to mercurial Mary. Mercurial is a word that is hard for me to say, but it basically means that we spike up and down, because mercury, the substance that's in a thermometer, is really volatile, which is why we use it to measure temperature. So Mary swings between being over helpful and abandoning, has really good intentions and really wants to help families, or really wants to help whoever she's connecting to, and feels their pain. However, when the tasks pile up, or when the family makes requests, she puts the work back on them because she's fatigued by the responsibility. So she may be overheard saying in the beginning, I'm with you every step of the way. And then you've got to take responsibility and do this on your own. I'm not your mother. And so thinking about what is coming up underneath for Mary. So asking you guys to put that in the chat if you have thoughts. And then asking, how do we help Mary? And you probably have already heard some of the traits and some of the other archetypes we've been talking about so far, that, you know, generally when I am confronted with someone who's suffering, my natural instinct is to want to say, what can I do to help you? I want to show up and help you however I can. And that often means that I will probably overpromise, because in that moment, I'm being driven by the desire to help. I'm being driven by my emotions, and I'm not maybe looking at my calendar or whatever. And so then later when I'm like reconciling, oh my God, I said I was going to do all of these things, and like, oh, I can't do this. And then I feel guilty. I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so guilty that I promised to do all these things that now I'm going to have to let them know I can't do. And most of us don't like feeling guilt. So then guilt sort of turns into blame, where we're like, well, I should not be having to do these things in the first place. You should be doing them yourself. And then we end up blaming the people that we just offered to help. And that happens for me all the time, where I'm like, oh, I'll make these phone calls. I'll show up. I'll do this. And then I like get overwhelmed. I get dysregulated. And then I don't want to feel guilty. And so then I'm like, I shouldn't be having to do this. And so that is really common for us, the Mary. And I hear some good suggestions here of teach Mary how to pace the expenditure of her personal resources. So pacing is a really great suggestion. And help her to set expectations with families more realistically to begin with. That's a great suggestion. And, and then I have a suggestion here too of what can I do to help you help yourself? So I think you guys are all making really great points about how at the beginning of the relationship, it really helps to sort of establish both roles of like, this is what I'm able to do. Like how can I help you to help yourself? Like, and also then, and creating maybe a work plan or sort of like a calendaring together where I'm not, over promising. I'm slowing myself down a little bit and saying, can I get back to you on that? Because for me, as the times that I felt like Mercurial Mary, it's because I'm rushing myself. I'm like, we're getting this done, which is really normal when we're dealing with someone who's in crisis. And so as much as crisis makes us feel like we've got to act suddenly, we've got to act now, any wiggle room we have to slow things down will usually mean that we're more realistically able to assess our own ability to do stuff. And also it means that we're more likely to be able to follow through with what we promise. So I actually don't have anything written up on Dana. I put this on the slide because I think that is, I have a coworker who I see where it's like, everything I do just feels like it's not right. And I always feel unsure about my decision, which when we're making really big choices about, or, really trying to help with someone, or we're spending money, or we're, trying to get someone in a program, that it just always kind of feels like the doubt can really impact us. And so that I wanted to add that up there just because that's another common one that I've seen in my life. And then healthy boundary herald, again, apologize for the healthy word because it's just the one that I had on here, but that herald communicates boundaries up front, doesn't expect others to know what his boundaries are. So we'll talk about that with characteristics of healthy boundaries, that, that we're not making anyone guess what our boundaries are. We're communicating them, and we're not expecting others to know. Has a great self-care routine, which I'm guessing is probably all throughout, hopefully, this NAMI training and other trainings you've gone to, is that we cannot properly address compassion fatigue, burnout, or vicarious trauma without addressing our own self-care, our own practices around that. And I used to, we'd have to go to a self-care training or something like that. And I was just like, gosh, I've gone to this. I've heard this before. I've seen this PowerPoint. And I would get so tired every time we go into a self-care training. And I've tried to switch the way that I view it now to, here's another opportunity for me to check in with my own, how I'm taking care of myself. And for me to really listen up and to see if I hear anything new. And if I don't hear anything new, to check in, am I actually doing the things that I'm hearing in this training? So if any of you relate to that sort of self-care training fatigue or self-care conversation fatigue, it's, it's that I take every opportunity I can to really look at okay, what is the barrier that's getting in the way of me taking care of myself now? Because self-care routine is also essential to holding boundaries, because as anybody who's had a screaming child asking for something that you set a boundary you're not going to give, and you're exhausted and you're in a grocery store, boundaries are much harder to hold when we're tired or on the spot or, struggling in any way. So sometimes it can't be avoided. Okay, so if you have any, so I would love to, if you're able to put in the chat, let me know who you identify with. So Hyper-Rigid Heather, Bernard, Eileen, Walter, Mary, Dana. I love sort of seeing over the couple of years I've been doing this training, seeing the trends of who folks identify with and who stood out to them. And some other trends that I've seen as I've done this training are that we also adjust ourselves. Sometimes we'll adjust ourselves based on what the circumstances are. Maybe there's one friend or family that we spend time with that we're boundaries go up when I'm around this person. There might be somebody else that we're I am just smooth like butter. I open up around this person. I am open, porous, I share everything. So there might be somebody else that you feel really comfortable with. And then also, again, when we've been burned, when we've had a situation where we've been hurt or we've gotten in trouble, maybe our boundaries will shut down. And so part of it is not so much, again, bad or good or whatever, but more just like, do we know where we're at? Being able to assess that so we know where to move. And so I see some Dana's, Eileen's, Mary, Harold. So just feel free to keep putting in that in the chat as we go. Mostly healthy Harold, great. A couple of Harolds here, great. Awesome. Now, again, not that there's anything wrong with anything else, but I know that Harold usually means that you're feeling a little better. Okay, so we're going to keep moving on, but feel free if you haven't put it in the chat to put in the chat what you're feeling. Okay, and so if we did this in person, we would kind of break out into groups and have a little discussion about this, or discussion as a group. But we're going to discuss this over chat as we've been doing. So who do you relate with the previous slide? Y'all are already putting that in the chat. Some great comments here. We have one comment that says, I started as Overinvolved Eileen at the beginning of a family caregiver role. After 3 years, I tried hyper rigid Heather. So totally, like, we get burnt out. We're like, boundaries closed. I'm not open for this anymore. And then now after 5+ years being better at Harold. So thank you for sharing that. That we adjust. We can kind of be like facets of a diamond where it's still us, but we're adjusting depending on what the need is of the person that I'm with. So now we'll have about a 5-minute conversation on these other questions here, which are, what are the purpose of creating boundaries? So why do we create boundaries? I'm going to talk about some of okay, and so question here, are we speaking about this as a role as a family member or supporting others in the community? And I think either. So the purpose of creating boundaries, because there's going to be a lot of overlap. So I think it would be probably pretty challenging for us to say, well, I create boundaries for completely different reasons in work than I do here. Though there may be some that don't overlap at all, but we're looking at sort of a Venn diagram here of the reason why we have boundaries, both in family, work, personal relationships, probably has some overlap. And yes, so I see, can you list each description of each character on the screen? I can go back so you can take a look at this again, but I do want to keep moving through the slides. Okay, so then we have some responses here about the purpose of creating boundaries. We have to protect yourself, to be functioning and stable, to create relationships. Oh, I love that, because we often think of boundaries as sort of like, I'm drawing them for these sort of negative reasons, or these sort of like protecting myself from negative things. But the creating boundaries also can open us up to more relationships, to be open for more relationships. Protect yourself and others. And I know earlier somebody talked about safety, healthier for me and for my family members. Okay, and moving on to the next question, or feel free to put answers to the question number 2 if you'd like. What are the characteristics of healthy boundaries? So when you meet someone that has good boundaries, how do you know they have healthy boundaries? What are they doing that clues you into the fact that they really have healthy boundaries? I know for me, I have a girlfriend that the way that I know she has healthy boundaries, and this is maybe a little mixed bag, but she says no to things that are not popular for her to say no to. So, I have those things in my life that I'm like, oh, well, I could never say no to this thing because people would think that I'm antisocial, or they wouldn't maybe want to invite me out again, or, what are they going to say about me? And I have a friend who's just like, if she's not feeling well or if she's not comfortable, she says no. And that's like, oh, that's that part of her. Maybe not all of her boundaries are things I admire, but I admire her ability to say no and kind of let other people worry about the response to that. So then, yeah, somebody else put that. Oh, a lot of you guys are saying when they say no. So when they say no and don't have to give an explanation, communication, No is a complete sentence. Effective communication. So a lot of empathetic, loving, but firm. So it sounds like a lot of what we're seeing, the characteristics of healthy boundaries are about partly about that communication, how we communicate them. I would say, yeah, so being direct, you need to do what's working for you, honest, if you need time to consider, ask for times before responding or doing. So that's great where we were talking about with like not responding immediately in the crisis, just because I think you want me to say yes or whatever. Some of the other things that I have written down that you'll see on the next slide are consistency, right? That a healthy boundary, those friends that we have that are like, don't call me after 6, and then they're calling you the next night at 10 or whatever. And it's like, oh, I'm so confused. It's really hard for me to follow your boundaries because they're all over the place. So, we want to, the consistency can be a characteristic of a healthy boundary. They're not toxic. Yeah. Okay. And then our third question here, and again, on the next slide, I have sort of a cheat sheet of the answers that I have, which are not, again, not all the answers. Where can we get guidance on what our boundaries should be? So keep your word on what are characteristics. So yes, they're consistent and we're probably following through with that. So where can we get guidance on boundaries? So good friends and family with boundaries and my supervisor. So great. So your supervisor, so maybe your work will give you guidance on your boundaries. Your friends, maybe your friends will be an example of boundaries. Maybe your family will be an example, or maybe just kind of your practice. Therapist, their support groups. So those are all places where maybe you're literally discussing boundaries, but also maybe you're getting examples of boundaries when you're in a support group and they're like, hey, don't go out of here and gossip about what we're talking about. So get to know yourself. So totally a good source of our boundaries can be like, I don't like it when strangers hug me. So that is not comfortable for me. Maybe I'm in a recovery community where everybody hugs each other, but I'm not crazy about being hugged. So I have to know myself instead of being like, well, everybody else is comfortable with this, but I'm not comfortable with this. So now here's my little sort of cheat sheet of some of the answers that we had. And you can read this and let me know if there's anything that you're like, Jessie, you totally missed this. So again, the purpose of boundaries, we talked about a lot of these. So safety, predictability, role modeling, preventing burnout, which is, again, the trigger for this whole presentation is that we want to be able to love people for our whole lives. We want to be able to be in relationships, to work in jobs where we're working with people. And if we're constantly burning out and needing to completely withdraw from relationships because it's too much, then it might be like, okay, we tweak our boundaries a little bit and then we can stay more engaged. So also ethical obligations, that maybe there are some boundaries that my work has that I totally don't agree with, but I have an obligation either to keep my license as a social worker or to stay employed at my job in order to hold this boundary. Then characteristics is that they're clear to the boundary holder. So if I have a boundary, I should know what that is. They're communicated up front. They're held by an individual, not forced upon others. And they're based on love for oneself as opposed to control. And you guys had really great points about that with talking about Overinvolved Eileen, that how many times have I wanted to set a boundary where I'm like, I really don't like it when you give me negative feedback, and I'm setting a boundary that you can't give me feedback, or I'm setting a boundary that you need to make the bed every day, or whatever it is. That me setting a boundary is not me controlling someone else, and it's that it's about me taking care of myself. So as much as possible, the boundary should be about my communication and my actions as opposed to like other people do this. So again, anything you have to add on these, I would love to hear, since these are certainly not all inclusive. And then guidance, you guys talked about some of these. So organizational policy, personal experience and preference, cultural norms. And so, and not the way we were raised, that we get guidance on what's okay or not okay based on where we live, who we grew up with. And then also as, that we may sort of code switch boundaries depending on the environment that we're in or the friend group we're around or the family member. That, like I'm incredibly touchy person when it comes to being around friends, but when I walk into a workspace, no one touches me and I don't touch anybody else, so you might also be like, oh my God, my boundaries change depending on what environment that I'm in. And I like to share this story about my boundaries. And when I was a therapist in Washington, D.C., I worked with youth that were on probation. And I had this client named, we'll say his name is Alan. And I was like a 25-year-old new therapist. I was driving Alan around for therapy because at like 9 o'clock at night, because you know how it is where you're kind of meeting your client where they're at, if you're in that professional setting, and meeting them somewhere that you can be private and have a conversation and also not feel so clinical. And so we were driving around Washington, D.C. and driving around the National Mall, which is where the monument and everything is. And we got pulled over by DC Park Police. And I was a young white woman and he was an African-American 19-year-old. And they immediately came up to his window and started asking him questions. Has he ever been arrested? Blah, 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 blah. They pulled us over because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, which I hadn't even noticed because he's wearing this like puffy coat. And, they go back to run my license and run my plates and probably to look up his name. And while he's sitting with me there in the car, he says, "Oh my gosh, Ms. Jessie, I have a gun on me." And I immediately freak out. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I get, super nervous that he's going to get arrested while he's with me on the session where I'm trying to help him. And we're just starting to get to know each other and develop some rapport. And I'm like getting ready to send a text to my boss. And the police come back, they pull him out of the car, sit him down on the curb and talk to him, but they didn't search him and they put him back in the car and we drove off. And as we're talking about and through this training, in that heat of the moment, in the crisis, and also as a new therapist where like I was doing all court mandated therapy with all youth where it was so challenging for me to prove that I had any value to offer. I immediately, without him asking, I was like, don't worry, I won't tell anybody. And that was something where, again, his problem became my problem, no boundaries, my identity or my role or my thought about my professional career or my job, or even what it would do long-term for my client were kind of out of my head because I just wanted to make this situation better. I wanted us to bond. And in my twisted, new therapist brain, I was like, maybe we'll really open up rapport here and be able to work together around, this scary experience. And that was an experience where I did end up telling a supervisor a couple weeks later during clinical supervision and ended up getting written up and really had to look at why did I do that? And something that I learned for myself was that every area of my life, not just my work life, in every area of my life, I was wanting to be needed more than wanted. I was trying to justify being around. I was trying to justify, why this person should want to talk to me about their life, or, that I'm a good therapist, or that like, that you're not just kind of slogging, having to meet with boring old Jessie as part of your probation. And that in my personal life, I was also doing that. I was like becoming friends or dating people that I was more focused on, like, trying to kind of trap them and make them feel like, oh gosh, Jessie is who I need, instead of looking at why, whether we enjoy each other's company or whether this, sort of not healthy boundaries, basically. And why I share that story is because all of us, the boat only goes as fast as its slowest rower. So if there's any area of your life where you're like, oh, in that area of my life, I got no boundaries and I'm just like barely staying afloat, it's going to start to permeate the rest of our lives. And so it's very important for us to look at, what are the underlying beliefs about this boundary that I'm holding? and you guys have pointed out really great things here about like Eileen, that Eileen is addicted to feeling useful. Somebody said that if I am so obsessed with needing to be useful, I'm going to tell my client, I'm going to keep this secret for you because I need to feel useful, not because it's helpful for him, not because it's helpful for my organization. And as you guys probably know, if we really looked at it, me offering to keep something secret is harmful to him. It is harmful to me. It is harmful to my workplace. But that took me therapy and talking to a supervisor and kind of getting in trouble for this to be a wake-up call of like, I'm doing my job to make myself feel better. And that's not really what this should be about. And also I wanted to quit. Like every day I was like tired of keeping these secrets. Or not keeping these secrets, but tired of giving all of myself. I was driving everyone. I was offering to get everyone McDonald's. I was buying McDonald's like 10 times a day, putting tons of miles on my car. And so I had to kind of reset and be like, that's not helping clients and that's not helping me. So like, how can I reset this? And so thank you guys for sharing that resonated with you. And that is where we pivot now to the tools that you'll be able to take home. And this, don't worry if you can't read this right side, because this is one of the handouts that you're going to get. And in this handout, this is just one of the pages of a couple of pages that are really useful, where it says the unhelpful belief is on the left side. So a belief like I can never trust anyone again. That is the healthy boundary building belief is on the right side. So if you resonate with that, I've been hurt, I can never trust anyone again, then you can kind of look at an opportunity for another healthy boundary building belief on the right side. Because underneath every boundary that causes us pain or suffering, there's an unhealthy belief that we need to address. So, and then here on this left side of this slide is, first of all, we need to become aware of our current boundaries. And you guys have already been doing that during this by, saying, oh, I identify with Eileen, I used to be Heather and now I'm more Harold. Then if there's an area where we particularly struggle, what are the underlying beliefs or more beliefs of my more harmful boundaries, my lack of boundaries? So, I love to give current present day examples of things. Like I have, no boundaries in my marriage, for example, where I take on every task. I'm like, if there's a thing to do, I don't brainstorm with my partner. I just sit down and I'm like, I've got it. I got to have control. And like, what's the underlying beliefs? The underlying belief there is like, things will fall apart if I don't do it myself, if I don't have my fingers in all the pots. And so I have to challenge that belief and be like, are things really going to fall apart, Jessie? And then I have to, maybe have a conversation. Well, there was that one time where things did fall apart, and maybe have to do some healing and some correcting of that belief. And then we start to move towards more aligned beliefs. So from the worksheet, healthy boundary builders. So, and yes, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint as well as part of the handouts. So then here, consider what you will have to sacrifice in order to hold the boundary. So in that example I just gave about, I don't even brainstorm with my partner. I take on all the tasks. And I see a comment here that it's showing respect with the person you're working with. I'm not really showing respect for my partner when I'm like, you can't do anything. I have to do it all. But what will I have to sacrifice in order to hold the boundary where I don't take over everything? I will have to sacrifice this idea that things have to be done in a certain way. So maybe that means that my partner moves a little more slowly with things getting done. Maybe they're not done exactly how I have to. So I have to be a little uncomfortable with things not being done how I want them to be done. And then I communicate the boundary and hold it, and then be willing to adjust as circumstances require. So even though that can be tricky, it's like, if I say, it's not like if our house is on fire, I'm like, well, we have to sit down and brainstorm before I can do anything. Like I can make the phone call and like take control in a crisis if that's really what's going on. But then I also might have to define for myself, everything feels like a crisis. And so kind of break down define what a crisis is for me. And so this is my contact information, which I will put back up in a second. But I also do want to show you guys the handout that you're going to be getting that has this healthy boundary. So some of this beginning stuff is stuff that we covered today that will sound kind of familiar, you know, healthy benefits. This is not my worksheet. This is one that there's a site of where it's from. And then signs of unhealthy boundaries. So this is great for you to look over and have as a tool if you feel like you're struggling with the boundaries. And then here's the rational boundary building thinking. So this is when you're getting ready to like really look at your own boundaries and decide what's underneath and how can I move toward a healthier boundary. This is a great, you know, worksheet to take a look at that. And then they also, I like here too, signs of unhealthy boundaries. So kind of looking at this list, and again, you know, not letting this list define your boundaries. You get to define your boundaries and what feels right or not right. But I find this worksheet like a very quick, helpful tool for you, or for, you know, if you are working with somebody else who's trying to work on their boundaries. And then the one other worksheet that you will get, just to get you familiar with, is this boundaries practice quiz. And this is fun. So if you are attending this training because you work in an environment where you're supporting clients and trying to talk about boundaries with clients, this practice quiz is a really great discussion tool. As you can probably tell from this, there's no automatic yes or no answer to any of these. There's some that are probably like, yeah, you mostly don't want to do that. But this is just a one-page sheet that I find super helpful to spur some conversation about, like, you know, just about boundaries. And you can use some of those other tools from the PowerPoint and from the other handout to really break down these tools if bringing boundaries back, you know, bringing a discussion of boundaries is something that you're interested in doing. So thank you guys. I know it's a challenging presentation method, but please reach out to me if you have any other questions, and I'm happy to talk or answer questions or share any other resources, or, you know, help you bring this back to wherever you are coming to this training from. And I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conversation. The handouts will come to you through, it sounds like the handouts will come to you through NAMI. Yes, at nami.org/events in a couple of days.